There are two things that rare map collectors love to see: sea monsters and legendary places. Today's map has no sea monsters, but it features one of the most prized cartographic legends. But perhaps more exciting than the oddities that are on this map are the even more bizarre places that aren't. A great example of the truth exceeding the legend. The map is from 1654. Its creator is the leading cartographer of his generation, Nicolas Sanson, royal geographer to the kings Louis XIII and Louis XIV. The subject is the Mogol Empire, that is, most of India and Indochina. It's a beautiful map by a first-rate cartographer and illustrates perfectly both the power and the limitations of 17th century Europe. Welcome to the Eye of History, where we are about all things maps and map collecting. Here we talk about the history of the map and the history on the map. And if you like gaining new perspectives on the world, on economic, history, society, culture, then like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. It's 1654. The 30 Years' War is over, and Europe is on the threshold of a period of expansion that in all of history can only be compared to the Mongol victories of Genghis Khan. To this point, the Europeans had won little territory beyond their continent, save in degenerate empires and plague-ravaged lands in the New World. But now merchant companies were probing the Old World, seeking opportunities for profit. Where conditions were most favorable, their cannon-heavy ships seized a few outposts. It wouldn't be immediately so, but eventually armies would follow, and the age of colonialism would begin in earnest. Back in Paris, Nicolas Sanson was collecting information on all lands of interest to the King of France, and to Frenchmen in general. This meant, well, everywhere. France was well behind the Portuguese and Dutch in the race for Asia, but Sanson was well connected and his maps were well regarded. Today's map is a fine representation of what educated Europeans knew of what is now India and Indochina. The only people who knew more were the officers of the Dutch East India Company and its competitors, men who knew how to keep the best information close to them. The region was of considerable interest to all Europeans. Most of India was ruled by the Grand Mogol, the same Shah Jahan that had built the Taj Mahal. His capital of Agra was twice the size of Paris. In all the world, only Peking and Istanbul were larger. To the west was Safavid Persia. To the east was the Tungu Empire, both vibrant and powerful states. Europeans had no illusions regarding the power and prestige of these countries. In plays and stories, the Sophie of Persia was represented as a paragon of virtue, tolerance, wisdom, and wealth. The Grand Mogul was given a slightly different treatment. Rich, to be sure, but possessing absolute power. Power that no European supposed could ever be challenged. The map is, like all of Sanson's work, gorgeous. The copperplate engraving is first-rate, the lettering is excellent, and the printing is flawless. It does suffer from a defect shared with almost all maps of the era. Although latitudes are fairly accurate, the longitudes are terribly exaggerated. Geographers were still enthralled to Ptolemy's ancient Geographia, tables of longitudes collected in the time of the Roman Empire. It was these same defective tables that led Columbus to believe that he could reach Asia in a few days of eastward sailing. But after Magellan had proven the immense breadth of the Pacific, geographers were well aware that Ptolemy's tables were flawed. Yet here, well over a century later, Sanson is still using them. It was yet another example of how scientific ideas can survive long after being disproved, simply due to reflexive repetition by people who knew better. The coloring is lovely, but as is often the case, carelessly incomplete and inaccurate. Coloring was often done well after the fact by independent dealers looking to dress up their inventory. In this case, the colorist apparently knew nothing of Indian geography. Looking around the map, we can easily identify some of the landmarks. Here is Cambay, the capital of Gujarat and a port that exceeded any in Europe except possibly Amsterdam. And flanking it are the two Portuguese ports, Diu and Damon, which they built a little over 100 years earlier. It's interesting that these two outposts don't get more attention from the mapmaker. There's no indication of their status or their territorial extent. At this time, Diu was a very substantial city, not that much smaller than Cambay, but the Portuguese aggressively kept their rival Europeans out of their trading towns, and thus Sanson had few references to work with. Hooghly, the Dutch's main center in Bengal, gets similarly parsimonious treatment. It's important to understand one thing about the Europeans in this era. Most of the activity was not centered on bringing Asian products back to Europe. The Dutch and Portuguese were active competitors to the Gujarati and others in the regional trade. For example, selling Bengali sugar and silk in Persia and Japan. The Portuguese owned Macau, which gave them a tremendous advantage over all others in the trade with China. The Dutch had captured a near monopoly on cloves and nutmeg, but more importantly had the most efficient ships in the region and the financial sophistication required to build and deploy them effectively. Neither hesitated to use force to capture and control key places like Malacca, Goa, and Colombo, but their success was as much due to their skills as merchants, financiers, and mariners as to military power. Going back to the map, to be frank, most of the place names on the map are beyond my ability to identify. It would take the expertise of a local to sift through all the misspellings and name changes and deal with the fact that many of these places just don't exist today. I did spend some time identifying some of the major landmarks, and while I was at it, I marked them according to how close Sanson was to the truth. Places that Sanson got generally correct, I marked in green. Places that were identifiable but misplaced, I marked in yellow. And places and areas that were impossible to identify and implausibly located, I put in red. The result gives us a pretty good idea of what Europeans really knew of the region. As you can see, the coastal ports were fairly well known. In the interior, though, only the great Mogol cities of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, cities like Agra, Delhi, Lahore, and those of the Silk Road, Kabul and Kandahar, are even imperfectly located. But most of the map is too distorted and misidentified to be at all useful. The Ganges River, one of India's most important features, is portrayed as arising from due north, not east to northeast. But misplacing India's greatest river is a minor error compared with omitting the greatest landmark of all, the Himalayas. Earlier maps of Asia hinted at the existence of the Himalayas. They placed a mountain range in the general area, usually calling it the Imaus, but such maps were always quite vague and conflated other ranges such as the Hindu Kush and the Tian Shan with the Himalayas. Sanson surely had received reports of the Himalayas from traveler accounts, but those accounts failed to appreciate the huge scale of this incredible mountain range. Sanson actually identifies his mountains as the Mont Caucasus, although the actual Caucasus Mountains are over 2,000 miles away. On the other side of the mountains is Tartary and Tibet, with Turkestan placed implausibly to the east. The confusion clearly shows how little Europe yet knew about the Asian interior. This ignorance has its most fanciful manifestation here, in northern Burma, which this map still calls the Kingdom of Pegu, even though Pegu had fallen to the Taungoo a full century earlier. Here is a huge lake, the Lake Chiamay, which is drained by no fewer than 5 rivers. These rivers recombine and split again in an enormous maze of channels, but we can more or less identify the Kaladan, Irrawaddy, and Salween among them, and perhaps the Brahmaputra. I'm only confident about the Irrawaddy and Salween. Lake Chiamay does not actually exist. There are only a handful of lakes in the world that are drained even by 2 rivers. They're called bifurcation lakes and are usually found on major divides, like Lake Titicaca in the Andes of South America. But 3 rivers from one lake is unheard of. There are just a couple examples in the world, like Lake Okeechobee in Florida, which drains into the Everglades through multiple channels, but such examples stretch the definition of river drainage. If something like Lake Chiamay did ever exist, one of those 4 channels would eventually erode a little more than the others, becoming wider and deeper, and once that process started, it would accelerate. In short order, one outlet would dominate, and eventually the other rivers would be cut off. So Nicolas Sanson was not much of a hydrologist. although in his time other intellectuals were writing about erosion and the ability of water and wind to shape the land. In this case, he was simply copying earlier maps for lack of any better information about the area. The first map showing Lake Chiamay was published exactly 100 years earlier by the leading Italian mapmaker of the time, Giacomo Gastaldi. Gastaldi was working from the writings of a Venetian diplomat, Giovanni Battista Ramusio, who in turn was likely cribbing from the account of a Portuguese historian. And just as Sanson credulously copied mapmakers from a century before, other generations after would keep the legend alive for another century after. Explorers were inspired to search for the miraculous lake, some encouraged by reports from locals that the Great Lake was just a couple days further upstream. Now that we've traced how the legend got passed on, from Portuguese to Dutch to French to others, let's take a look at where the legend began. Chiamay might be just a corrupted form of Himalaya, which in turn means home of snow. It's certainly the case that the larger rivers in the region all originate in the Himalayas, or at least in the Tibetan Plateau just beyond. So it's plausible that the legend is based on a simple misunderstanding, the headwaters being not a lake, but a mountain range. But it's only plausible because there's also one remarkable geographical feature sitting right about where Lake Chiamay is supposed to be. In fact, I consider it to be perhaps the most incredible geological feature on the planet, something that basic geophysics tells us should not exist. Not because it's due to some exotic geological process, not an extraterrestrial encounter or bizarre geochemical phenomenon, but because it's due to an ordinary process occurring on a grand scale with unbelievable and unbelievably unlikely precision. And I'm sure you've never heard of it. Let's start with a modern map of the Salween River. I'll cut and paste Lake Chiamay onto this map so that you can see what exactly Sanson had imagined when he made his map. As you can see, where the lake is supposed to be is actually the southeastern edge of the Himalayas. Now let me take away the lake and you can see what's actually there. Now let's zoom in. The map calls this the Three Parallel Rivers of Yunnan, which is a typically verbose Chinese name. If you look closely, there are actually 4 parallel rivers, but the fourth is the Irrawaddy, which is on the Burma side of the border. The 2 to the east are the Mekong and the Yangtze, and in this spot the canyons of the 4 rivers are perfectly parallel, each of their canyons among the deepest in the world, and each just barely 20 miles from the next. This Google Earth image gives a better view. The snow-capped mountains rise over 18,000 feet, looming 12,000 feet or more above the rivers. Only in the Himalayas are canyons of such scale possible, and here we have 3. I'll note the canyon of the Irrawaddy peters out at about the halfway point. 3 running side by side for almost 200 miles. If we zoom back out, and here I have a map that's a little easier to read, we can see that the 3 rivers all rise from different parts of Tibet. They draw closer together as they pass through the Himalayas, and then upon emerging from the mountains, they go in 3 different directions, draining into 3 different seas. The Salween enters the Bay of Bengal, the Mekong into the South China Sea, and the Yangtze into the East China Sea. And these are long rivers, the 3rd, the 12th, and the 26th longest in the world. It's rare enough to see 2 rivers converge to within such a short distance and then diverge again. 3 rivers converging and diverging are incomparably rarer. 3 rivers converging, running parallel for 200 miles, and then diverging again is unique. 3 rivers converging, running parallel for 200 miles, and then diverging into 3 different seas is simply beyond all probability. Some truly amazing geophysics are behind this. To understand how this happened, you must know a little bit about plate tectonics and especially about how the Himalayas were created. At one time, India was not connected to Asia at all. It was an enormous island lurking to the south, slowly creeping towards the north. Our 3 rivers may or may not have already existed, but if not, they would have formed relatively early in this process. So on my crude little map, I've drawn roughly where they ought to have been. As India collided with Asia, it pushed up Tibet in the Himalayas, something like an enormous bulldozer. If the rivers didn't already exist, they would have been formed as the collision created faults in the Asian crust, faults that would have appeared as wrinkles perpendicular to the collision. The rivers then flushed out these wrinkles, eroding them into deep canyons. Even as the collision continued and the Asian plate continued to rise and move, the rivers survived by cutting their canyons faster than the earth could move below them. We see this elsewhere in the world, and it explains why sometimes we see rivers cutting directly through a mountain range, such as the Columbia Gorge bisecting the Cascade Mountains. Rivers can generally cut their channel faster than a tectonic uplift can raise the land. As long as the uplift results only in local landslides, the river can clear those out. But that's a very, very big if. This process continued for 50 million years or so, and is still continuing today. In that time, the canyons were pushed together and moved as a group at least 100 miles, perhaps more, all while preserving their streams. In that time, no other channels opened up above the gorges to steal the river's watersheds. At no time did a kink form in the wrinkles, which would have opened a gap and connected the canyons. Had that happened, one stream would have quickly captured the others. In 50 million years and 10,000 feet of uplift, this never happened. To get a sense of how unlikely this is, let's look at another geological province that closely resembles the Himalayas. Here is a view of the Zagros Mountains in Iran. You can see the very same wrinkled terrain as in the Himalayas, and they exist for much the same reason, as the Zagros is being formed by the Arabian plate colliding with Asia. However, the Zagros is obviously much smaller, and the collision has been going on for only about half as long. So let's look at what the Zagros rivers look like. As you can see, it doesn't look like the three canyons at all. You can definitely see that the rivers generally follow the wrinkles most of the time, and I assure you that many of them have carved deep canyons. But there are so many transverse cuts through that nothing like the three canyons have formed or been preserved. You certainly don't see three rivers, or even two rivers, with headwaters far apart, converging so close, and then diverging again, like we see in the three canyons. So our map today substituted a fanciful legend for an unbelievable reality. It is a truth is stranger than fiction story writ on a tectonic scale. Lake Chiamay appeared in different forms on at least 60 different maps, the first in 1554 and the last in 1780. Besides Sanson, map makers from every European country, Ortelius, Hondius, Plancius, Blaeu, Vischer, Homan, Moll, Speed, even Mercator, put it on their maps. The fiction even reached China and appears on the first world map ever composed there. Map collectors love this sort of thing. Just as stamp collectors love error stamps and coin collectors pay huge premiums for double strikes, map collectors value highly geographical fictions like Lake Chiamay. The best example are maps showing California as an island. Such maps are very expensive to collect. Lake Chiamay is not quite as desirable as that, but among similar Sanson maps, this map sells for about half again what those others do. I have to point out that if a map from 1654 showed what really existed in that spot, it would be worth much, much, much more than that. Sanson was prolific and is one of the most popular cartographers to collect. Some of his maps of the New World sell for prices on the order of $5,000, but most of his maps sell for between $200 and $500. Almost all of his maps were made for atlases, so they're conveniently and uniformly sized. They're perfect for framing, although I prefer to keep my maps in my horizontal file drawers so that I can more easily take them out and study them. Sanson's elegant style was very color-friendly, and the one framed Sanson in my possession looks great on my big wall of maps. Sanson's cartouches were particularly nice, but unfortunately the cartouche on my map was not given any color. That omission, and the generally sloppy coloring, does not enhance this map's value. The overall condition is very good, so in appraising it, I'd start with $300 as the base price for a Sanson of this size. Add 50 to 100% for Lake Chiamay and the general subject. Maps of Asia generally do sell more than maps of Europe, but not as well as maps of the Americas. And I'd subtract a little for the careless coloring. I bought it for under $400, and I figure that I bought it fairly well. As always, though, I remind everyone watching, I am not a professional appraiser, just another hobbyist, and I might just love my maps a little too much. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you in the next one.